programme, Mick Brown looks at books which have sought to stimulate changes in the real world. And in the discussion of feminist novels, there is some sexually explicit language. Cult Classics 5, Moving Mountains.
I'm here in Camden Town, North London. As you come out of Camden Town Station, you look across and see the Penguin Bookshop. They have a huge window here with cult books written in the top of the window and a huge array of books in the window, all the books that we've been talking about in this series. This really does look like the place to find cult books, and we're going to go inside and see what they've got here. And here we are at the cult section, and I can see a lot of the authors that we've been talking about in this series. Robert M. Persig's Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Dispatches, Michael Hare, P.D. Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous, Ken Kesey, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook, American Psycho, Bret Easton Ellis, Philip K. Dick, Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach. Cult books obviously go down very well in Camden Town. I'm going to go and talk to Joanna Silk and Martin Smith here and find out why. We're going through the computer listing of all the cult books. Tell me what are some of the best-selling cult books you've got here?
Well, we've got Jonathan Livingston Seagull up here, and if we look at that, we can see we've sold 116 copies of that book in the last year, which is, for an old book, very good. And then...
How would that compare with the modern day, with the new release, say?
A new release, we obviously would sell very well for a couple of months, but then would trail off usually completely to 1s or 2s a month, whereas something like Jonathan Livingston Seagull, we're regularly selling 15, 20 a month, constantly.
Got American Psycho here. How's that been doing?
Well, that's sold phenomenally well, really. We've sold 179 of that in the last year, which, that started off as a good seller anyway. But to keep that momentum going, we regard as a very successful title. I don't think it would have sold that well if we just put it straight into our fiction section.
What about Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance?
Well, that's, again, 200 copies over a year. Can't be bad.
You can see from the printout this November and December 92, before we put it in the cult section, it was only selling 4 or 5 a month. As soon as it went in, the sales went up to about 30 every month.
It actually helps a book to be called a cult book. This is extraordinary, isn't it? So people are coming here specifically because you have a cult section, you think?
Yes, word's getting round, definitely. I mean, some of my friends will go, go to the bookshop in Camden, they've got a really great cult section, and I'll go, I work there every day. But it's nice to know anyway.
Brilliant. So far in this series, we've been looking at the way cult books shape, inform, and excite the individual. In this, the final programme in the series, we'll be looking at books which have more far-reaching social implications. Cult books of feminism and the Green Movement. Doris Lessing has denied that her Golden Notebook, published in 1962, is any kind of feminist gospel, but it was one of the driving texts of the feminist movement nonetheless. It tells the story of Anna Wolf, a young writer undergoing a crisis of identity as a woman and as a member of the Communist Party, at a time when communist idealism was evaporating in the face of the dawning truth about Stalin. A series of different-coloured notebooks chronicle the self-doubts leading to her nervous breakdown. Her recovery, the realisation of a single, strong, unified self, is finally expressed in one golden notebook.
I must dress Janet, get her breakfast, send her off to school, get Michael's breakfast, don't forget him out of tea, etc., etc. With this useless but apparently unavoidable tension, resentment is also switched on. Janet is waking. Simultaneously, Michael stirs, and I feel him growing big against my buttocks. The resentment takes the form of course he chooses now, when I'm unrelaxed and listening for Janet. But the anger is not related to him. It is the disease of women in our time. I can see it in women's faces, their voices every day. The woman's emotion. Resentment against injustice and impersonal poison. The unlucky ones who do not know it is impersonal turn it against their men. The lucky ones, like me, fight it.
It was regarded as an enormous revelation how women thought and felt. And so women seized on it and said, and still do. I get letters to this day from women saying, this book has expressed me. I had a lot of experience by then of people who'd cracked up. I'd lived with a man who was completely round the bend, and a lot of other people around me were cracking up because of the collapse of communism. And I'd also known some religious fanatics. And what struck me was that the trouble with them all was that they were mono-minded. And these people tend to crack up because life is not like that. Life is not a straight path from correctness to correctness. It's chaos. So I was, in the framework of that book, I tried to express a cracking up. Now, this is what I was writing about. But the interesting thing about the Golden Notebook is it's nearly always regarded as a blast of anger on behalf of women. Now, all I can say is that this must have been how I was feeling. Because there it is.
But it wasn't what you were intending.
No, not at all.
The book's abiding theme is Anna Wharf's determination to forge herself as a free woman, intellectually, politically, and sexually. Younger readers in particular might be surprised at the descriptions of sexual freedoms flourishing in the 1950s. But Doris Lessing is at pains to point out that sexual experimentation didn't start with the invention of the pill.
I think our generation was the luckiest it's ever been, because first there was birth control, which wasn't a pill, but it was competent, it was wasn't aesthetically... I will skip all that. The fact was there was perfectly adequate birth control, and you didn't get pregnant, and we still were in love, you see. The idea that one just go to bed with everyone just because they were there would quite shocked us. So we were both romantic and comparatively safe. There was a lot of romantic sex going on, and don't forget the war, which is the essence of romanticism. And hearts were breaking everywhere after the most highly romantic sexual experiences. Only, of course, we used words like love, you see.
Doris Lessing's generation might have used words like love, but by the time Erica Jong's feminist cult classic Fear of Flying was published a decade later, love in its romantic sense had become almost a dirty word, implying the surrender of a woman's independence.
In the early 70s, we were trying to cast off the shackles of love. Love was a terrible burden to us all.
Well,
we said, we've all been killed by love, you know. No more love. Deliver us from love. And I think the idea was we would prove that we were just as good as men by being as sexually free as men.
Fear of Flying is the story of Isadora Wing, married 5 years to a psychoanalyst and feeling an itch for sexual experience, which she's determined to scratch. It's the kind of itch that, felt by men, have been expressed in countless books and films. But Fear of Flying, for its day, was shocking. Women, Jong was saying, have sexual drives too. The book went on to sell 10 million copies.
I wrote it because I thought it needed to be written.
Mm-hmm.
Many women had written novels about female discontents, but they tended to be, I thought, rather whiny novels about why is my husband cheating on me. They were not about women who truly were independent, at least struggling towards independence, which Isadora was in Fear of Flying. And so I was very dissatisfied with these other books by women that were thought to be liberated books. And I was very inspired, I must say, by Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint.
In what way?
In the sense that it seemed to me that for whatever you could say about the book, it got to the truth about how men felt. And I thought, has anyone ever written that way for a woman?
And what about those other longings which marriage stifled? To discover whether you could still live alone inside your own head. To discover whether you could manage to survive in a cabin in the woods without going mad. To discover, in short, whether you were still whole after so many years of being half of something. 5 years of marriage had made me itchy for all those things. Itchy for sex, and itchy for the life of a recluse. It is heresy in America to embrace any way of life except as half of a couple. There is simply no dignified way for a woman to live alone. Her husbandlessness, her childlessness, her selfishness, in short, is a reproach to the American way of life.
Isadora's response to this is what she calls the zipless fuck, the perfect fantasy sexual encounter, involving no trouble, no guilt, no comebacks, no nasty sexually transmitted diseases, no reality.
It was a platonic ideal. Zipless, because when you came together, zippers fell away like rose petals. Underwear blew off in one breath like dandelion fluff. Tongues intertwined and turned liquid. Your whole soul flowed out through your tongue and into the mouth of your lover.
By definition, our fantasies, our dreams, and particularly our sexual dreams, which are inspired by yearning, can never really be lived out. I mean, if they're lived out, you discover that the person has faults, feet of clay. Perhaps he farts, perhaps he belches. He can never be the fantasy person that you have in a dream when you never get to know the person at all. So naturally, sexual fantasies are outside of life. I never meant to imply that we can all live them out. But remember where the world was in 1970, 71 when I was writing this book. Suddenly the pill was widely available. It was the post-pill paradise. A lot of people at that time, a lot of my contemporaries, went stumbling off to communes in California or elsewhere and fried their brains, had many, many, many lovers and open marriages, which marriages mostly fell apart because there was so much jealousy involved. But we were the generation that was experimenting with that. So it seemed as if a great social change had taken place, and the panacea was sex. All you need is love, 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 love. As the 70s progressed, we realized that promiscuity was no sort of answer at all. Not only because people got herpes and diseases, but because they found themselves feeling terribly hollow, terribly unloved. The relationships were quite empty, and solid relationships began to fall apart as people went off and slept with all their friends and their spouses' friends and so on. But for that moment in the early 70s, it seemed like the answer. It seemed that if you could love everybody all the time and put a little LSD in the water supply, everything would be fine.
According to Marilyn French, the author of another feminist cult classic, The Women's Room, Fear of Flying was a revolutionary book in its depiction of female sexuality.
Females didn't really have sexuality in early novels. For a woman not only to have sexual feelings, to be allowed to have them, and not to die, and not to be punished for them, but to take her own sexuality in her own hands is really amazing. And that's what happens with Neen and Jong, where women decide to live their sexual lives as they choose to live them. And that is very new.
The Women's Room is about Myra Ward, a middle American housewife chafing against the kind of suburban conformity epitomized by Doris Day movies and martini parties. The little woman staying at home with the kids, while husband flexes his ambitions at the corporate workface. Myra's politicization was a metaphor for the dawning of feminism among millions of American and British women in the 60s and 70s. The book exploded like a bombshell on its publication in 1977 and went on to sell in millions, with a cover proclaiming in the timeless cult platitude that it would change your life.
I set out to tell the truth about what I knew about women. I knew that I had never read it in a novel in my life. I knew that underneath women's conversation, the women of my generation, was just huge rage and frustration. I knew that story had never been told. I knew that there had never been a novel that really showed the daily work of women. It's essential character. What women did in my generation was stay home and raise the children and keep the home, and that was treated as something really quite contemptible, marginal to the real business of life, which was building airplanes and weapons and whatever. I wanted to do a couple of things. I wanted to show women's rage. I wanted to show the way they're thwarted when they tried to move out of the situation they were locked into. But I also wanted to show the really profound importance of what they did every day.
I just ruined your life? She wanted to point out to him the injustice of his attack. For the fact that he felt right in making it, felt that he had legitimate grounds to treat her like a naughty child, overwhelmed her. It was a force against which she could not struggle, for his legitimacy was supported by the outside world, and she knew that. She tried. Did I chase you around the bed? You said your way was safe. You said it. It is. Yeah, that's why I'm pregnant. It is, I tell you. Are you saying you are not the father of this child? He glared at her with bitter hate. How should I know? She wept fully in great jolting sobs, and he held her against him in astonishment, saying, I'm sorry, thinking, she imagined, that she was weeping about his suspicion of her fidelity. Not knowing, never to know, never to understand. Finally, he smiled up at her as her sobs came less often and less strong, and asked her if she weren't hungry. She understood. She rose and made dinner. And in January, she had the baby, and a year and a half later, she had another. After that, she got another diaphragm. But by then, she was a different person.
Well, the mail was overwhelming when the women's room first came out, the first few years, and I still get mail about it. And everywhere I go, women come up to me and say, you did change my life. I know that's a blurb on the book, but it really happened. It has changed the discourse, I think, for a lot of women, and changed the terms in which they see themselves, and that's, I think, important.
Interestingly, while these 3 books are undoubtedly cult classics, they sell less well to a younger generation.
When all the cult books that are now in their own section were in their own particular subsections, and the sales were good of those books, and we then decided we'd take them all out and put them all together and see what happened, and the sales have quadrupled. Bottom line, I guess, is just the sales. If something doesn't work, then for us, that is no longer a cult book, 'cause it's not selling anymore. It's had its day, it's passé, it's said what it had to say to the era that it was written in. So back it goes on the shelf and into oblivion.
There is an element of truth of what Joanna says, but some cult books have undoubtedly lasted. Thinking about it, it seems to me that the ones which have lasted are quite a lot of the ones from the 60s, more related to the drugs culture. Fear and Loathing, Well, Doors of Perception's another one, which is, you know, and that's kind of a crossover, really, because that's mystical and drug-related, but they do seem to still sell, and also, you know, you have things like Slaughterhouse 5 and Catch-22, which still sell.
Are you surprised that so many young people should be buying books that are so old?
No, because all young people think that they're finding stuff for the first time. This sounds really, really pompous, doesn't it? So they are the first person ever to have hitched or to have taken drugs or whatever, and to them it's all new, and therefore those books have still got something to say to them.
I mean, the people who like these books love them, and I think that's something important to say. They kind of like their Bibles. A number of people who come in and buy Fear and Loathing, they talk to you and say, oh, this is a great book, you know, and I think its youth is such an important element to it. I don't know what happens when you get older.
So are these books just for young people then, or do you think they have some validity for middle-aged people, elderly people?
Yes, they do have appeal for mature people, but they're a certain type of mature person, and certainly in this area, I mean North London, there's a sort of artistic, creative environment, or trendy environment. I mean, our customers are interested in that sort of thing, and rather than, if you go to other parts of the country, more provincial, I don't know whether a cult section like this would work so well in Lytham St Anne's or somewhere, because there probably isn't the readership of those sorts of people trying to explore themselves. I don't know, I've been really horrible to Lytham St Anne's now.
You've got Jonathan Livingston Seagull there, I noticed, in your cult section. What persuaded you to bring Jonathan Livingston Seagull out of the mysticism section, as it were, and put it into the cult section?
It has that thing, whatever that undefinable cultness about it, that relates to my life, or I wish I could think like that, or I wish I was a bird flying in the sky instead of selling books in North London on Sunday.
The last 3 cult authors we're coming to in this series are again preoccupied with trying to bring about changes in the material world. They reflect a new way of looking at nature and our contemporary anxiety about ecological destruction.
We and our life system are very much more extraordinary than many will allow. The everyday commonplace things that we all take for granted and think we understand turn out to be elusive and mysterious. Despite years of intensive and expensive research, nobody yet knows the answer to even the most basic questions, such as what makes us sleep, or why we tend to forget our dreams, or how we ever remember anything at all. Each time a line of research seems to be on the brink of a definitive discovery, on the point of putting an end to centuries of speculation, the last in an ever-diminishing nest of puzzle boxes opens unexpectedly to reveal yet another whole universe beyond. Everything around us is filled with mystery and magic. I find in this no cause for despair. On the contrary, our inability to find easy answers fills me with a fierce pride in our ambivalent biology, and with a constant sense of wonder and delight that we should be part of anything so profound.
Lyall Watson is a natural scientist. His book, starting with Supernature, published in 1972, explore the premise that many things occur in the biological world that science has no explanation for, and therefore tends to dismiss. They include telepathy, and some of the effects on humans of the sun, the moon, and sound vibration. Watson argues that examination of these phenomena would lead to a richer science and a fuller understanding of the mysteries of the universe.
I use that word supernature deliberately. It's a new word. It's a coined word. It's the noun for the common adjective supernatural, because I don't like the word supernatural. I think that it implies that it's beyond natural explanation or understanding. I don't think any of these things are. All we need to do is to push the envelope a little to extend the frontiers. And that's what I've tried to do. I've tried to collect all the odds and ends that the biological sciences weren't looking at, and to find some handle for them, and to suggest that all of these things are perfectly ordinary if you're prepared to accept a broader description of nature. I have no investment in a theory. I have no philosophy to market. What I'm doing is just looking and listening in a good old-fashioned scientific way, in the way that the Victorian naturalists did. I think there's still a role for that kind of activity in science, because the things I'm collecting are falling by the wayside. There are odds and ends that are being lost unless I pick them up and bring them back and say, hey, this doesn't quite fit, but I think it's useful. And if we put enough of these odds and ends together, I believe they make some kind of sense. I'm just the field man for the Heisenberg of the natural sciences, I hope will appear sometime.
The Tao of Physics, published in 1975, was one of the first books to point out the parallels between modern physics and Eastern mysticism. Its publishers describe it on the cover as a cult book, with some justification. It sold over 1 million copies and became a definitive New Age text. Its Austrian author, Dr. Fritjof Capra, is a nuclear physicist. It struck him that in order to understand the picture that was emerging of subatomic physics, ordinary rational thought was no longer adequate. It needed something closer to the intuitive expansion of the mind that occurs in meditation.
A beautiful experience set me on the road to writing this book. I was sitting by the ocean one late summer afternoon, watching the waves rolling in and feeling the rhythm of my breathing, when I suddenly became aware of my whole environment as being engaged in a gigantic cosmic dance. Being a physicist, I knew that the sand, rocks, water, and air around me were made of vibrating molecules and atoms, and that these consisted of particles which interacted with one another by creating and destroying other particles. All this was familiar to me from my research in high-energy physics, but as I sat on that beach, my former experiences came to life. I saw cascades of energy coming down from outer space. I saw the atoms of the elements and those of my body participating in this cosmic dance of energy. I felt its rhythm, and I heard its sound, and at that moment I knew that this was the dance of Shiva, the lord of dancers, worshipped by the Hindus.
For Capra, the interconnectedness of all things, which is experienced in the mystic state, and reaffirmed in subatomic physics, has unavoidable ecological implications.
We are turning from a mechanistic worldview to an ecological worldview, based on the awareness of a fundamental connectedness of all things, on the awareness that we are all embedded in the cyclical processes of nature. And that kind of awareness of being embedded in a larger whole, of being fundamentally connected with everything else, is ultimately a spiritual or religious awareness. I sort of represent and promote ecology as a spiritual practice. And there's the school of deep ecology, which is both a philosophical school and a movement. It's an earth-centered spirituality. And I feel very strongly about this, that this is the appropriate spirituality for our time.
We'll finish this series by talking to someone who seems destined to be a cult author of the future. Andrew Harvey's books about a spiritual search, Journey to Ladakh and Hidden Journey, have been highly praised for the way in which they express his own spiritual experiences with fierce intellectual rigour, great personal warmth, and high literary style. He also recently co-authored the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, a modern interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which has sold over 100,000 copies. Harvey is a man who has taken the leap into the realm of direct mystical experience and returned claiming a personal insight into the implicate order of all things. He was born in India, but educated in Britain. At 22, he was the youngest ever Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, at the very summit of academic life. Then came a series of initiations through Tibetan and Hindu teachers, which forced him to flee from what he describes as the concentration camp of reason.
The rational mind has created the chaos, the hell, the concentration camp of reason in which we are all starving to death, spiritually, emotionally, and now, final masterpiece of man, actually, because the environment has become the final victim of the rational mind. Damn it, it's time that people face that the whole enterprise of Western civilization is ending in total disaster. If we don't make major decisions in the next 20 years to alter radically our whole industrial policy all over the world, the environment will be so devastated that there will be no habitable world and no possible life in the world very soon. The media, which has so much power, does nothing but promulgate the basest and stupidest values. The great paradox is that this is a civilization that claims to give man a very noble vision, but in fact, what the media really tells us we are our hungry, sex-starved animals dying. It's the mystics of all the cultures that have given us the vision of who we really are, which are the children of God, the divine children, capable of an extraordinary ecstatic experience on earth of completeness and unity with the cosmos. And any vision short of that is selling us short. It's not simply that we are the children of God, which we are, it's also that the creation itself is divine, and that the creation itself is drenched with divine light, and everything in it is sacred and holy and radiating the love of God, because it's created out of the love of God. And we have then to see that and to be responsible for it. And that's the only way in which we're going to save this world, is by realizing what this world is. This world is the theatre for our enlightenment and the showing forth of the glory and grandeur of God.
Andrew Harvey advocates radical inner transformation, but change is one of the watchwords of the cult book. All the books in this series deal with challenging convention and accepted modes of behaviour. All constitute a sense of adventure. I wouldn't pretend that we've covered every cult book in this series. Everyone will have their own list. But I hope we've got to the heart of the cult genre. In the course of presenting cult classics, I've met some extraordinary authors, and I've been reading some books that I first read 20 years ago that made a profound impression on me then, and I've been pleasantly surprised how well they stand the test of time. You don't have to be 16 to enjoy Capra in the Rye, or 22 to be enthralled by the vitality of On the Road, or the questing spirit of Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. I hope you've enjoyed listening to Cult Classics as much as I've enjoyed presenting it, and I hope too that these programs will have encouraged you to pick up at least some of these books for the first, or maybe the second time, and set off on your own adventure.
In Cult Classics 5, Moving Mountains, the readers were Elizabeth Bell and Jack Claff. The programmes were researched by Morag Massey, presented by Mick Brown, and produced in Bristol by Martin Buckley. And if you're interested in a reading list for the series, you can obtain one by ringing the Cult Classics office on Bristol 742341. The code for Bristol 0272 and the number 742341.